2013 report from UNL's Department of Agricultural Economics told how Nebraska's ag sector, through property taxes, had become the heavy lifter of local government services. From 2012 to 2013, ag land accounted for 87% of the state's total land valuation increase. Nebraska's ag land is currently taxed at 75% of its assessed value, but Nebraska Extension Public Policy Specialist Brad Lubben says there are several bills in the Nebraska Legislature that include property tax reform, including alternatives regarding agriculture. We recently talked with Brad and asked how much of an emphasis state legislators were putting on reform this session.
Well, it's interesting. Tax reform in general, property tax relief in particular, has been an issue ever since the campaign. And then the newly elected governor in his State of the State address highlighted property taxes high on the agenda. And we expected the legislature to certainly pick it up and move something forward. At this point, we're still uncertain as to what that vehicle for relief might be.
Describe the concepts that are out there relating to ag land.
Yeah. One of the concepts, one of the first proposals to surface was to reduce the assessed valuation of farmland. Currently 75%, a proposal to reduce it to 65% of projected or estimated market value. That would reduce the assessed valuation, certainly, but that doesn't necessarily translate into an equal percentage reduction in the tax bill. That's more a function of how dependent is your taxing district on ag land. If it's entirely ag land, for example, changing the assessment doesn't do much to the final bill. It's what the taxing bodies spend that really impacts the final bill. So that bill itself to reduce the assessed valuation died in committee. Whether the idea still has some legs in a final compromise remains to be seen.
There's another idea of toying with the property tax credit, right? Now,
Correct.
How would that work?
Correct. As it currently works, there's, I believe, $160 million a year committed to property tax credits. Essentially, the taxing bodies face the assessed valuations, their levies, they establish a tax bill, and this is just a credit off the top of that bill. So it doesn't change the local revenues to the taxing jurisdictions, it just increases or provides relief to the taxpayer. The proposal in the budget right now would say raise that from $160 million a year to $200 million a year. So some relief, certainly. Compare that to the $2 billion plus in actual property taxes collected. It's still a small percentage reduction, but it does provide some relief.
So tell me about the concept that would increase state aid to these schools and maybe by that way reduce the burden from agriculture.
Well, there are two other bigger concepts in terms of how you might provide property tax relief by readjusting more over the entire formula for local jurisdictions. One of those issues is the state aid to schools. State aid of almost $1 billion a year to local school districts certainly does provide some relief against local property tax levies and property tax increases. But certainly increasing state aid to schools doesn't necessarily translate into a dollar for dollar reduction in property taxes. That's a function of what schools are spending. And state aid to schools, state aid to local governments, it's still a function of what gets spent locally, balancing that sort of demand for services against the challenge or the burden on property tax base.
What you're saying is it's not a zero-sum game. Just because you increase the state aid doesn't mean they'll decrease spending by that amount.
There's no clause that says total revenues must remain constant. It's simply an increase in state aid. We would certainly expect that to help relieve property tax pressure, but for districts that might be at a limit but see the need for increased spending, state aid increases that opportunity. It doesn't necessarily decrease the tax levy.
The final that we'll talk about that you hinted at is reforming the way that the mechanism is determined that money goes to schools. How complicated is that?
Well, along with the idea of how do you reallocate state dollars, sales tax and income tax dollars to state aid for schools and local districts, is a big debate about that whole formula. The current formula allocates dollars to districts based in part on enrollment, based on need, and the challenge of reforming that formula seems to be that almost all districts, both rural and urban, are complaining about how the current formula works, both arguing that they need more funds out of that formula. It's hard to imagine reforming that formula without substantially finding new revenues. from the state level. So part of the debate is not just about how does the formula work. Part of the debate is how do local services, like schools in particular, that are the typically the largest single part of that local property tax bill. How do you fund schools? Should the dependence be on property taxes that might reflect local demands, might reflect local resources, but don't necessarily move in the same direction that enrollment numbers move? So what's the best formula to actually fund those local jurisdictions, particularly schools? That's a bigger issue. We've not yet really addressed that, and certainly I don't expect in the final weeks of the legislature that that's high on the list, but in a longer run perspective, managing local services, demand for services, expectations for local services, and that formula for how to fund them is a big question.
Brad says the legislature is scheduled to meet through the first week of June, and a final budget and tax legislation figured to be one of its final acts.